They say the force is strong in some bloodlines, and this one traces back to the mountains of Puerto Rico. You know the face, from LA Law to NYPD Blue, Star Wars, Dexter, Sons of Anarchy, The West Wing, East New York, an Emmy winner, a Jedi councilman, a Boricua icon. You may know him as Bail Organa, but before Alderaan, before the lights, the scripts, and the legacy, there was Peñuelas. I followed the paper trail, not across galaxies, but through baptismal records, census sheets, and the forgotten names buried in the archives. His mother was Puerto Rican, his father came from Suriname, but his maternal line tells a deeper story of migration, identity, and ancestral resilience. So if you ever wondered how a kid from Brooklyn became royalty of Alderaan, this is the story you are looking for. I am Dairen Castro Torres, the genealogist, and this is Jimmy Smits, the genealogy of a Puerto Rican Jedi. Jimmy Smits was born in Brooklyn in 1955, the son of a working-class family with roots that stretch across continents. His father, Cornelius Smits, came from Suriname and was of Dutch heritage. His mother, Clara Emelina Pola, was Puerto Rican, born in the town of Peñuelas, a connection that would come to define much of Jimmy's cultural identity. He grew up in a tight-knit, devout Catholic household alongside his two sisters. Although raised in New York, Smits spent part of his childhood in Puerto Rico, where he was suddenly immersed in a Spanish-speaking environment. Smits has proudly identified as Puerto Rican ever since and remains deeply connected to the island. The first piece of the puzzle ignites the entire story: the birth certificate of Clara Emelina Pola Bermudez, born on November 14, 1930 in Peñuelas, Puerto Rico. The record was filed by her father, Joaquin Pola, a married man and a farmer, living in the barrio of Rusio, a working-class man of the land, typical of Puerto Rico's post-colonial generation, still clawing their way through the shadows of empire and hardship. It declares that Joaquin and his wife had a baby girl at 1 p.m. and named her Clara Emelina. The record shows that she was of the raza blanca, or white, a term commonly used by Puerto Rican civil registries in the early 20th century. It tells us more about post-colonial racial classification than it does about identity, but it's part of the story, her story. And there, in the left margin, boxed in clean type, Clara Emelina Pola Bermudez, the future mother of Jimmy Smits. This was the first breath of a woman whose life would cross oceans, raise a generation in New York, and help shape one of Hollywood's most iconic Puerto Rican actors. But that's just the beginning. Here they are in 1940, line 9, Joaquin Pola y Orengo, 49 years old, a farmer, head of household, and his wife, Tomasa Bermudez, 43 years old, listed as costurera, a seamstress, working from home, side by side, raising a household in the barrio of Rusio in Peñuelas. But this wasn't just a family, it was a world. One by one, their children filled the lines: Carmen, Hector Manuel, Ángel Ernesto, Zoraida, Raúl, Consuelo, Luz Alicia, Francisco Benedicto, and there it is, Clara Emelina, and her two younger sisters, Digna Milagros and Celia Tomasa. She's just 9 years old here. It's humbling to see a child on paper, sandwiched between siblings, her story waiting to be told. And what a household it was. 11 kids under one roof, a mother sewing, a father tilling the land, just grit, love, and the quiet determination to survive. And that's when I found the next clue. By 1950, the world had shifted. The war was over, Puerto Rico was changing, and Clara Emelina Pola Bermudez had already begun her transformation. She was just 19, barely out of adolescence, But here, on line 6, she's listed as head of household. That title, head of household, says more than any census box ever could. Clara was living in Segundo Barrio Ponce, the bustling heart of southern Puerto Rico. Her parents had passed. The family home in Peñuelas was now a memory. But Clara wasn't alone. Her younger sisters, Digna, Milagros, and Celia, were living with her. 3 young women making their own way in the world. And what was Clara doing for work? She was already an X-ray technician working at a private hospital. That's huge. Not just for a woman in 1950s Puerto Rico, but for someone so young coming from such humble beginnings. She made $120 that year. That doesn't sound like much now, but in 1950, for a woman working in medicine, it meant everything. It meant independence. It meant leadership. It meant a future. In 1950, she was just a teenager, a sister, a provider, and already a quiet force, a head of the household. And that's when I realized she was the true foundation of the Smits legacy. In 1954, Clara Emelina Pola, the same young woman who once led her sisters through grief and survival in Ponce, stood in the Bronx and took a leap of her own. This simple record, a marriage license from New York City, hides an extraordinary crossroad. Clara, Puerto Rican, born in Peñuelas, raised in hardship, trained in medicine, was now in the mainland United States. And across from her stood Cornelius Smits, a Dutchman from Suriname, worlds away from the cane fields of Peñuelas. Together, they applied for a marriage license. On paper, it's just ink and numbers. But for me, it marks the beginning of something bigger. The union that would shape a family, raise 3 children, and eventually give us one of the most recognizable Latino actors of our time. Before the cameras, before the lights, before the fame, there was this moment. Bronx, 1954, 2 lives joining, and a legacy just beginning. This is Clara Emelina Pola, later known as Emelina Pola Smits. Born in September 14, 1930 in Peñuelas, Puerto Rico, her life would span nearly a century and bridge 2 worlds. She was one of 11 children raised in the shadow of the mountains, shaped by loss, faith, and resilience. As a young woman, she became trained as an X-ray technician, rare for her time, and the anchor of her family after both parents passed. In 1954, she married Cornelius Smits in the Bronx, and together they raised 3 children in Brooklyn, Jimmy, Diana, and Yvonne. To her children, she was a mother. To her sisters, she was a guardian. To history, she is the root of something remarkable. Clara passed away on April 23, 2015 in Brooklyn, New York. But her story and her bloodline live on screens, in stories, and in every step her descendants take. Now we go back another generation, to 1913. This is the marriage record of Joaquin Pola Orengo and Tomasa Bermudez Rivera, the maternal grandparents of Jimmy Smits. They were married on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, in the town of Peñuelas, Puerto Rico. Joaquin was 26, a local farmer, born and raised in the hills of Peñuelas. This document tells us he was the legitimate son of Marte Pola and Juana Orengo. His mother was already deceased at the time of the wedding. His bride, Tomasa, was 21. She too was from Peñuelas, the daughter of Ramon Bermudez and Maria Paz Rivera, 2 young people coming together to build a future. This record doesn't just capture a wedding, it anchors the lineage of a Hollywood star to the soil of Puerto Rico. And that lineage was only the beginning. This next document takes us back to the final days of the Spanish Empire in Puerto Rico. It's the death record of Juana Orengo y Santiago, dated April 11, 1898, barely a month before the U.S. invasion reached the island's southern coast. Juana died in Peñuelas, and the record lists her as soltera, or unmarried. But what caught my eye was something deeper. She died in the home of Marte Pola Irizarry, tying her once again to the Pola family we've been following. She was around 30 years old, born under Spanish rule, and buried just as that rule was coming to an end. Her parents are listed: Salome, Orengo, and Andrea, Santiago, both long deceased. Her 5 children are mentioned, including Joaquin, grandfather of Jimmy Smits. This wasn't just a death certificate. It was a relic of a fading world, a Puerto Rico that was about to be turned upside down. This is the death record of Marte Pola y Irizarry, dated October 26, 1922 in Peñuelas. He was listed as casado, or married, to Olfina Mercado. He was a farmer and 90 years old when he passed. The cause of death was listed as senilidad, or senile, or simply old age. And here's the important part. Martes was the son of Francisco Pola and Monserrate Irizarry, both deceased. Martes Pola was a bridge between the colonial past and the future of this family, a patriarch whose name survived across generations, right down to Clara Emelina Pola. And as we've seen, Clara would carry that legacy far from the mountains of Peñuelas, to Ponce, to New York, and to the heart of American pop culture. But first, we need to go back one more generation. Now, we go deep, back 2 centuries. This weathered page is dated in 1819, and it tells the story of a union that would ripple through time. Francisco Antonio Pola, son of Jorge Pola and Leonarda Garcia, stood at the altar in Peñuelas. At his side, Maria Monserrate Irizarry, natural daughter of Dionisia Irizarry. Their names are written in ink and in faith, in the very church where their future descendants would be baptized, married, and buried. This was more than a wedding. It was an origin point. From their bloodline would descend Martes Pola, who cared for Juana Orengo in her final days, and eventually Clara Pola, whose son would become a cultural icon, Jimmy Smits. This is how we trace legacy, not through crowns or empires, but through the whispered vows of everyday people who loved, labored, and lived in the hills of Peñuelas. This story doesn't start in Hollywood. It starts here. Francisco Antonio Pola and Maria Monserrate Irizarry Medina didn't just have one child. They had a daughter, Encarnación Pola Irizarry. She married Manuel Ruiz Irizarry, and their descendants followed a parallel path. Monserrate Ruiz Pola, who married Lucas Evangelista Rivera, and they were the parents of Ana Rivera Ruiz, who married Alfredo Sepúlveda, and they were the parents of Lucila Sepúlveda, who married Máximo Pagan Rodriguez, and they were the parents of Carmen Pagan, who married Dairen Torres Acevedo, and they were the parents of Teresa Torres, who married Luis Castro Urbina, and they were the parents of yours truly, Dairen Castro Torres, the genealogist, a third cousin 3 times removed of Jimmy Smits. 2 branches of the same root. One grew up to be a famous actor, and the other, I traced the bloodlines that made it all possible. This is Puerto Rican history, and it runs in our veins. Moving right along, our next record takes us to Andrea Santiago y Morales, mother of the aforementioned Juana Orengo y Santiago. This brittle, black and gray death record from Peñuelas, Puerto Rico, is all that officially remains. The year was 1880. The Spanish Empire still held Puerto Rico, and the echoes of the empire reached even the small parishes of the island's south. That's where I found this entry, tucked into the faded registry of Peñuelas. It records her death on the 13th of May. Andrea, it says, was 66 years old and a widow, once married to Salome Orengo, a man whose name had already faded from the official memory. She was the daughter of Marcos Santiago and Catalina Morales, names that barely survived in ink. But this wasn't just a death record, it was a thread. Andrea was the mother of Juana Orengo y Santiago, who would live almost long enough to witness the end of Spanish rule before the American flag was hoisted over Puerto Rico in 1898. From Juana, the line would eventually lead to Clara Emilina Pola Bermudez, and to her son, the actor who wielded a lightsaber and legislation alike, Jimmy Smits. And this makes Andrea Santiago y Morales a matriarch in this particular branch of Jimmy's bloodline. But Andrea's story doesn't end in ink, because just a few lines later, I found my next clue. I found something else interesting in the old parishes of the archives of Peñuelas, the second marriage record of Marcos Santiago Maldonado, the father of Andrea Santiago y Morales. The date was May 7th, 1850, and the priest confirmed that the groom, Marcos, was a vecino of Peñuelas, and he had fulfilled the requirements of the Christian doctrine of the laws of the church and the customs of the time, and so he stood ready to marry again. Marcos was a widower. His first wife, Catalina Morales, had already passed away. That detail alone opens up a window of the hardships of the 19th century Puerto Rico, where life expectancy was short and death often came young. This time, Marcos was marrying Leonalda Cortez. It confirms that Marcos was the son of Juan Hilario Santiago and Atancia Maldonado. For me, this record wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a turning point, because now I had the names of the next generation, and that's when I found the next clue. We're in Utuado. The year is 1760, 16 years before the American Revolution. I'm holding a transcription of the baptismal record of a girl named Atanasia, born on the 2nd of May and baptized just 16 days later on the 18th. Her birth wasn't just recorded, it was witnessed, celebrated, and etched into the pages of Puerto Rico's colonial history. Her father, Don Nicolas Maldonado, a retired military captain, one of the few men of the time to carry that title with honor, and her mother, Maria Manuela Santiago, both of them natives of Arecibo. Atanasia wasn't just born into a family, she was born into a legacy. Each name in this record opened new branches. Each role, each title hinted at alliances, land, and power. This was a foundational stone in the Maldonado lineage, and it brought me to one step closer to the world they lived in. But this wasn't the only Maldonado that caught my attention, and that's when I uncovered something even older. I kept digging, and that's when I found them. Nicolas Maldonado and Manuela Santiago, married on the 14th of May in 1738 in the parish of San Felipe de Arecibo. This wasn't just any union, it was the beginning of a lineage that would stretch across centuries, one that I could trace through time. The document is old, faded ink on worn parchment, but the story leaps off the page. Nicolas, legitimate son of Lope Maldonado and Juana Orozco, both of Arecibo, and Manuela, daughter of Manuela Santiago, likely born from an earlier undocumented union. This was colonial Puerto Rico, a time of Spanish garrisons, sugarcane fields, and long processions through dirt roads to a stone chapel. And inside one of those chapels, Nicolas and Manuela stood before God and their neighbors, bound by vows that would ripple through generations. And just when I thought the story finally settled, I came across the names that started it all. And there it was, entry number 5, dated August 4th, 1710, Lope Maldonado and Juana de Orozco. Their marriage is recorded in Book 1 of Marriages for the town of Arecibo, transcribed by the great genealogist Teresa de Castro Sedgwick, a foundational record in the reconstruction of early Puerto Rican families, because this is the generation that planted its roots in the very soil of Puerto Rico. Lope Maldonado, born around 1692, may have been the son of another Lope Maldonado and his wife Isabel de Leon, but this cannot be verified. And he wasn't just any vecino. According to Fernando Pico, Don Lope was one of the key figures in the founding of Utuado. That means that Don Lope wasn't just present at the creation of Utuado, he helped lead it. He and Juana de Orozco had multiple children, including Nicolás Maldonado and his brother Felipe, who married Jacinta Rivera. And from that branch descends Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which makes her and Jimmy Smits distant cousins and makes them part of the same web of lineage of resistance and legacy. This isn't just genealogy. It's the story of Puerto Rico's earliest settlers, people who built towns, defended borders, and laid the groundwork for future generations. So now you know, Jimmy Smits didn't just rise from Brooklyn streets or Hollywood stages. He rose from the mountains of Peñuelas, from farmers and seamstresses and colonial captains, from census lines and widows' margins, from girls who became matriarchs and men who became bridges, from Lope Maldonado and Juana de Orozco, settlers of Arecibo, founders of Utuado, from Clara and Melina Pola Bermudez, a quiet force who built a life from grief and grit, from stories not in scripts but in sacramental ink, fragile pages, and silences between generations. And somewhere in that same tapestry of blood and struggle, he rose, a shared inheritance of pride, resistance, and power. And me, I walk between them, tracing names across centuries, pulling memory from the margins, and resurrecting our ancestors one record at a time. Because this isn't just the genealogy of Jimmy Smits. This is the genealogy of a people, and it runs in our veins. I am Dairen Castro Torres, the genealogist, and if you carry any of these names, Pola, Santiago, Maldonado, Orengo, Irizarry, Bermudez, then maybe, just maybe, the force is strong in your bloodline too.